Is that what it was? Just, yeah. All right. Three, two, one. Hey, everybody. This is Jason with Isn't Life Curious and Curious About Cannabis. Thank you so much for tuning in once again. I'm excited today to sit down with a new friend of mine. We managed to cross paths at the recent ACS conference that I told you about recently that I had a chance to speak at. I'm here with Josh Smith, who is also wrapped up in this crazy world of cannabis testing and lab quality and all of this sort of stuff. So we had some great off-camera chats about the state of testing, the state of quality of products in the industry, and sort of practical steps forward. And it seemed like a natural next step to bring him on the show and carry those conversations forward. So, Josh, thank you so much for being willing to come on the podcast today.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. So, to introduce people a little bit into your background, and then we'll get into some of the juicy stuff. You're based out of Michigan, doing testing out of there. Do you mind sharing a little bit about your background and kind of what got you into the cannabis testing space? Because one thing I like about you is that you and I both have a similar background in that we come from biology and then have been wrapped up in also the world of applied chemistry at the same time. Um, so I'd love to introduce listeners to a little bit about your background and some of your early work in crystallography and PCR and all of this sort of stuff that we've talked about. And then we'll get into the cannabis stuff and where we're at today.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, like most people in cannabis, it's we got here by a winding road and not
Yeah.
very not. So my background is actually so my undergraduate degree is genetics and development, and my graduate degree is clinical microbiology. I after grad school, I worked at the University of Wisconsin Biotech Center setting up a facility. Uh, we called it the poor man's gene chip, but it was a gene chip lab. For those people that don't know what a gene chip is, basically you'd put a whole bunch of strands of DNA on this little tiny glass slide or this glass piece, and you would take a professor would come in or whoever would come in and they would take a RNA from whatever they're looking for, and they would throw it on this gene chip. And it's basically a fishing expedition to see
Mhm.
what was upregulated, what was downregulated, what wasn't, what was turned off, for further studies. And for my part of that, they would then pick five-ish targets that they wanted to look at. I would then design the PCR assay, the real-time PCR assay. At the back in the day, it was the reverse transcription real-time PCR, and we had just gotten away from the Roche Light Cycler 2.0, which was these little glass capillaries that broke all the time, and it sounded like a jet engine was taking off. And we were just getting the nice big 96-volt plate setups. We were using a Roche 480, which ironically the bioMérieux qPCR uh, software they use is Roche 480 software.
Oh,
I
wow,
found
that's
that out.
funny.
I found that out about a year ago. It's like, holy crap, I remember this. Um, but so they would come in, they would tell me, I would design the assay for them, run the assay for them, give them the results, and they'd pay us. After that, I got into pharmaceutical R&D for 10 years. Company's still around actually, but we were using slightly modified E. coli
Hmm.
to fight infections. First one was basically probiotics for your bladder when you're catheterized. You would impregnate this, uh, basically the KY, with this E. coli. It would recolonize your bladder and it would cause an asymptomatic infection. So
Mm.
basically probiotics.
Yep.
Um, and then because within a week, 5 days, you're almost guaranteed a urinary tract infection if you've got a catheter. Um, and then the other one we were using was using bacterial conjugation, so bacterial sex, to
Hmm.
deliver a basically a killer DNA plasmid payload to other bacteria and kill them.
Oh, cool. Wow.
We were working with the DoD. The civilian market was second and third degree burn wounds because after about 48
Mm.
hours, you can actually hold a black light up to a burn wound and it'll glow because of it's all Pseudomonas.
Wow. Wow.
Um,
I didn't know that.
Yeah, it's kind of weird. It's real to actually see it. And then the Department of Defense wanted it because there was a gram-negative coming out of Iraq, Afghanistan. It's kind of everywhere, but it can desiccate and it can dry up on
Hmm.
surfaces and then rehydrate and come back easier than a lot of other bugs can. So
Ah.
Acinetobacter baumannii. I, to be honest, I couldn't tell you if it changed names again because microbiologists love to change names of everything after it's been a year.
Yep.
Um, but yeah, it worked really well. Dropped. I got it to basically within 5 minutes or so of application, it dropped the bacterial load by thousandfold or ten
Wow.
thousandfold. But it's trying to sell that to people and investors and saying, "Hey, I'm going to put this bacteria on your skin, and it's going to help you." It's
Yeah.
kind of a hard sell.
Yep. Yep.
But
Yep.
we were in talks with Fauci before. Well, when he was back at NAAID, and he was basically really pushing for us. So they're still alive. My stock options are still valid.
It's better than
I'm
most
still
of us
holding
can
out.
say.
I'm holding out hope. They're worth pennies on the dollar, but I'm hoping.
Yeah. No, that's
Um,
that's cool though, this idea of like a bacterial Trojan horse, basically.
yeah, and
Hmm.
because it's through bacterial conjugation, um, there's no resistance to it
Right.
because it's basically just
It's
all right. Here you
accepted.
go. Yep,
Yeah.
it's completely passive. It's one of the ways bacteria pick up antibiotic resistance normally, so that pathway is almost always open. Um, and then after that, I was actually, well, kind of concurrently, I was working on developing my own diagnostic assay uh, for bacterial infections, which I eventually got patented. But when I was before the patents got approved, I was working with this guy who eventually became my partner, and he was trying to get me investors or trying to find somebody that it was either help me
Hmm.
license it or help me develop it a little more. And one day he asked me, "What do you know about marijuana or hemp?"
The inevitable question comes.
I I asked him, "Well, officially or unofficially, what are we? Where are you getting with it? Where are you going with this?" And he knew a guy so this is up in Connecticut in the Northeast. He knew a guy up in Vermont that had a hemp farm, and he asked me if I could take a look at his test results for him.
Hmm.
Now this is in 17, right around there, and I didn't know whether to laugh or cry,
Yeah, I'm sure. Yeah.
especially at the micro side. I mean, I still remember there was this little like on the this was on the pesticides, and there was a little asterisk at the bottom of the pesticide section that said, I forget which pesticide it was, but basically the positive control for that run didn't amplify, but they still called it negative.
Even they have no negative predictive power at all.
Oh my!
Yeah.
I was just like, wow.
Yeah.
That
And
was,
reporting it. Yeah, putting it on the
and,
COA.
and
Yeah.
then reported it, and they put the little corner on it.
That's hilarious. Yeah, it's like the
Um,
asterisk makes it fine. It's okay.
oh my God! And that was so. If my dad didn't have hay fever, I would have been seventh generation on the same dairy farm.
Yeah, well,
Um, and so I grew up on the farm. I grew up in a very rural area. Hell, you could see cows from my, high school windows on both sides.
I can relate to that. Yeah.
Oh my, Pennsylvania. I like to tell people I've spent 2 hours north of Pittsburgh. Um, and in the end, the farmer always gets screwed. I mean,
That's
let's face
right.
it. I mean, if the if anybody ever came back, they go and give those results, say it passes, okay, whatever. But there's that asterisk, right? If that farmer then gets gets a spot inspection or a test, and it says he fails, well, that's on him when that should have been on the lab for giving that.
Yeah.
Anyway, so I ended up from there. We decided to start up my own lab. I was in Madison, Wisconsin at the time. So and my I was officially a non-processing processor because the state of Wisconsin did not even have that setup. They still don't have medical or recreational, but the hemp boom, they were very,
Mm-hmm.
very big pushing hemp, which a lot of people don't know. Back in World War II, hemp was huge due to the lines on the ships, a lot of the parachutes, some of the
Yeah.
parachutes and the boards were made with hemp blends. And Wisconsin actually used to produce two crops, outdoor crops of fiber hemp a year back in World War II. They've completely lost that now.
Yeah.
No one knows how they did it. But my license there was also $100 a year.
Oh, wow. Nice.
So,
Score.
but being in the biotech scene over there, and they've got a pretty big, especially with the University of Wisconsin sitting there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I was able to get some lab incubator space for really cheap that had, an autoclave and all the major water filters and things like that that would cost a lot of money for me to install myself in a new location where we could start up,
Yep.
basically make sure my stuff works, and then go to a recreational and medical state because it's the exact same test, the exact same metrics.
Mm.
I tried to say low THC and high THC cannabis for hemp marijuana
Mm-hmm.
just because it's all cannabis.
Right.
And some reason, a lot of people out in the street that aren't really connected to the scene seem to think that marijuana and hemp are different things. I mean, it's
Yeah.
a completely and utterly arbitrary line drawn in the sand. Nixon found the paper actually.
Yeah.
Somebody
Oh,
sent
did
that
you
paper.
finally find it? Yeah, I've been trying to hunt that down.
I'll dig it out and send it to you.
Yeah.
But it actually states in the paper for this study only because because we needed a way to classify things. We chose 0.3% total THC as the dividing line, and it should only be used for classification in this study. And
Yeah.
they used
Yeah.
leaves and stems. They didn't even use flowers for
Right.
most of it.
Right.
So it was kind of interesting to see that paper actually in light because I've heard about it for years now.
Yeah.
Um,
It's
so
become that limit has become gospel, basically, at least in the United States.
which is pointless. It should be if they're going to do it that way, it should be 1%. But I think it's more ratio based. But
I
that's a whole
completely
other topic.
agree. Yep.
But so we grew and expand, and we were testing probably 300 plus clients in 30 states in their hemp. Which let me tell you, trying to keep tabs of all the hemp laws in 2018, 2019
Mm-hmm.
was fun.
Yeah.
Seeing some pretty shady stuff all around, even worse than a lot of the marijuana guys see. And we bought a lab in Detroit, Abco Labs, if anybody is listening
Mm-hmm.
from the Detroit area. Um, and eventually, as is cannabis, my partner screwed us over, stopped paying. They were the money guys. They stopped paying the bills, and the
That's
company folded.
that's funny how that happens. Yeah. Uh-huh.
So I usually, one of those things you can always tell that somebody's been in cannabis for right about 2, 3 years is kind of I feel is like a good gauge point. Certainly no more than 5, but you kind of say. And then my partner screwed us over, and anybody who's been in the industry long enough says, "Yep, that's cannabis."
That's right. It's become a kind of trade phrase between me and some of my friends where it's like, hey, that's cannabis.
Eh, it is cannabis.
It's like a
So,
sitcom at this point. Yeah.
but in between there, yeah, we were our big thing. So my lab director, she was also a microbiologist. She ran a couple of the clinical labs at the University of Wisconsin Hospital for some doctors and professors over there. And our big thing we were trying to push was the microbiology side because
Yeah.
it's very much cannabis chemists. I mean, it's mostly chemists. I would say probably 95%. And
Yeah.
it's kind of an overlooked part of the industry, which I think it's starting to get a little more, especially with things like HLVD coming out, hot
Hmm.
latent thyroid, uh, and some other things that I have a feeling we're going to touch on here in a little bit. But it's there. I think overall, from my perspective, even not whether it's chemists or microbiologists or whatever. I think people don't understand the purpose of the lab. They just see it as the government's outsourcing. Like they think we're the cops,
Yes.
and we're
Yep.
not.
Yep.
We're here to keep people honest. At the same time, so as I mentioned with growing up around farmers, 2018, 2019, everybody complains about how the hemp prices crashed, right?
Right.
At one point in time, and right before harvest, I had a guy that was getting over $1,000 a pound for hemp flower.
Wow. Wow.
I mean, and it was really nice stuff. He had people coming from Colorado to Minnesota. He was growing in Minnesota. He's from Illinois, so easily. But yeah, I think he was getting $1,500 to $1,200 to $1,500 a pound for his outdoor flower. It was amazing. When I had some in a freezer, and when I showed it to the lab techs up in Detroit, they were like, "Wait, this is hemp?"
Right. Right.
But
and I remember the prices of like kilos of CBD oil back in 2018, 2019 as well. Because I was working with some product manufacturers, helping them in their labs. And I mean, there was a time where things were very nice in terms of the money that people were making with hemp, up until that crash.
Well, I guess my thing with it was that at the time, and still, dairy prices had tanked. Soybean prices were horrible.
That's true.
Corn stuff prices are bad unless you get the ethanol subsidies from the government. All these guys were just looking for a way to make money
Keep
for their
going.
families and keep their farms alive. One of the biggest, actually, there's a huge epidemic in the Midwest right now of farmers committing suicide because they're underwater, and this has been their life since their grandfathers were born, and they know what to do. And a lot of these guys got into this thinking, like if you go out to the store right now and you buy corn seed, on that corn, it will tell you exactly how many days it is to harvest, the exact nutrient profile you need to be providing for, fertilizer, the exact characteristics of that corn, the planting depth, planting spacings, everything. Even now, that's not even a thing in cannabis. I mean, it's getting a little better, but these things that are genetic, the stuff they're used to buying are pure, stable strains, genetic phenotype strains. And it drives me nuts when I hear, and I get it, it's in industry lingo now, but when people talk genetics in cannabis, just like when people call a processing facility a lab, it's not a lab, it's a processing facility, but because it confuses things. But what they're talking about are phenotypes. They're talking about cultivars. They're talking about strains. They're not talking about the genetics of it, because none of these guys are paying me to have an actual sequence done. There's some,
but in the grand scheme of things, very little.
Yep. And considering this industry, the vast majority of them, hell, it's hard enough to get them to pay $400 or $300, $400 for a lab test, when it, even if a full sequence is $1,500. Yeah. They're not paying it. But these farmers were getting screwed, and they're buying seeds from these people that are just out there to make a quick buck, and half of them are 90% feminized or 95% feminized, $2, $3 a seed kind of thing. And they got screwed. One of the worst parts of my job for a long time was I had to spend I was the one calling people for fails. Yeah. And when you got to tell a farmer who just drops $15,000-$20,000 on a little plot that they're hot in August, with barely any flower buds, whoever put out Abacus that in 2018, 2019, personally, I think rotten hell for the amount of people that you screwed over, because every single thing of Abacus that I saw in southern Wisconsin, Minnesota, and most of the country was, I mean, I walked into a field of it and it was 7 different plants.
Yeah, yeah. No, I had the same experience on the same season in Oregon. And I don't know if it was the same seed batch or just the same type of thing going on, but there was a someone who was trying to flip these basically F2 seeds, the just very casually, made, opportunistic thing. Like I have a field of seeds, let's gather them and sell them. And not be totally honest about where they came from, or anything like that. And I had to go out into a field for a lab and do a check just to see, where their CBD content was at. And I came back both, kind of scared to deliver the news, but also excited from a scientific perspective. Because I was like, you have every ratio under the sun in your field, from 20-1 THC to 20-1 CBD and everything in between. And in it's all because of these seeds. And so, like, it's devastating because then the next conversation is like, well, that's like $1 million loss. Like,
Yeah, and there was no
you,
crop insurance because it
right.
was, even though technically it was federally legal, hemp, you still couldn't get crop insurance for it. Hell, you
Yep.
could barely get a bank.
Yep.
Still can't. So, I mean, and then it didn't help that, people, these labs were popping up that people were dropping this equipment on, and no one had a validated method, and there was no, I mean, I am one of those people that I will not advocate for every lab has to have the same kind of test, like the exact same test.
I agree.
Way
Yeah.
they test. I think that blocks innovation, that forces you to do things, forcing people to do something in exact one way. I think just complicates the process and makes it worse.
Yep.
Having those validation standards is absolutely necessary, and as long as you can hit that, it basically gives you that benchmark. As long as
That's
you can
right.
hit that benchmark, you're great. So
Yeah,
you
it's
can
it's
use
just
whatever.
saying it's just saying like give us a reason to trust your data.
Yep.
Like I mean, it's like there's many ways you can realize data, but just make sure that whatever data you give us, we know how you came up with it and that there's rationale to trust it. It's a
And
very basic thing.
and everybody was copying everybody, but everybody had proprietary methods,
Oh
which
yeah, yeah,
they
yeah. Of
do.
course, of
They like
course.
to
Yeah.
hide them. It's like that's not science. That's not how it goes. If I want to open a clinical lab, I buy the method.
And
It's
none of
already
this is that
validated.
new. Yeah.
You tell everybody exactly how it's done on the result sheet. I mean, that's one of the requirements in CLIA. But you know, like, and I think some of that untrustworthiness that popped up against the labs was, one, you had a lot of people that didn't know what they were doing. Hell, half the labs I saw a bunch of them that popped up that were basically some guy that took some undergraduate chemistry.
Right.
I mean, one of them, I know of one that popped up a trailer,
Oh
basically a
no.
truck
Yeah.
trailer, and was running a
Yeah.
lab out of the back of his semi trailer.
I've seen a
But
couple of those. Yep.
so I mean, you have that. Then you have farmers who are buying stuff that they're promised. I got a COA that says these seeds are this, or this crop is supposed to be this. And you know, when you have two sides that are completely uncomfortable with what's
Hmm.
going on, unfortunately, it came back on the labs that the labs are the problem. And then then you have the shady people that, because it's not regulated by damn near anybody,
Hmm.
including the state agency supposed to, then you get lab shopping because you corner the market, you get the people in. Even if you stop doing all the THC inflations, everybody gets into the cultural zeitgeist that
Hmm.
this is the lab you go to for the highest potency, and
Right. You have
that's
your
kind of where we're at.
the sort of the scene knows what the quote unquote good labs and bad labs are, so to speak, however they define that.
Yep.
And I'm glad you brought this around to lab shopping because that's one thing I definitely want to touch on, because I think there's plenty of attention on the issue of THC lab shopping. Like we all know it's like well published at this point and well understood that people are hopping around labs trying to find the highest THC numbers so they can get better value for their product. But one thing I wanted to talk to you about, particularly with your microbiology background, is lab shopping related to other things beyond potency? Because that is also happening and that doesn't get talked about as much. There are labs that are known for having higher pass rates for aspergillus, let's say. There are labs known for having higher pass rates for chlorphenapyr, and things like that, getting into the pesticide side. So, kind of honing in on your background, your unique expertise on microbiology and DNA and RNA. What are issues that you see related to lab quality with the microbiological assays? Do you think that is, just tell me if you agree with what I'm saying. I believe there's a lot of shady stuff going on with the microbiological assays that is largely getting sort of caught up in a lot of the theater going on right now around labs, that it's just sort of getting missed. But I think you and I both know there are some very critical issues with some of these assays.
So real quick, I'm gonna circle back and I want to touch on
Yeah.
THC just real
Yeah,
quick.
go for it.
I actually think part of the one of the crazy things about the THC shopping is I think it's mostly due to an uneducated consumer. I think the big part of this is, let's face it, most people know nothing about cannabis. The vast
Right.
majority of people don't know. They know that THC gets them high.
Right.
They're going. It's like they're buying alcohol, right? They, but they know I only have so much money, and I know THC gets me high, so I'm getting the most bang for my buck.
Yes.
It's
Yeah.
not how the process works. It's not how your body reacts. Your body's receptors max out at anywhere between 15 and 20% THC. So you're just getting there a little faster. You're not like it's the same thing. And the crazy part is like literally every single grow I've ever been to they always say, well, everybody hates the THC game. And they have this one strain that is the best thing ever. It's the greatest thing ever, but they can't sell it because it's 16%. So they grow this little plot in the back just for them and their workers.
Yep.
It's literally the only point. And I just want to get it out there again, because I think it needs to be said everywhere. I mean, I always like to compare this to either the craft brewing industry or alcohol. You can go down the street right now to buy moonshine from the liquor store, Everclear.
Right.
Why don't you? It tastes like shit.
Yep.
You're forced anything over 35% total THC. I'm sorry, you're approaching on the borderline genetic impossibility. Like anything over that, anything over 30%, I would be highly skeptical on. I usually tell people knock 5% off the THC number from anything you buy, regardless. But you can go, it is 30%, 35%. You're forcing that plant to produce solely THC. You're taking all that extra energy and putting it into THC. All the flavors, all the tastes, all the aromas that you get are gone. They don't have any room to make. They're also less healthy. Those terpenes and things, those other cannabinoids, they're designed by the plant to do things. Some of them are to fight infections.
It's not just for us.
It's not just for us. They're metabolites for the plant. And you make a less healthy plant, pushing it to that, it's like when you brew, people tell you don't use turbo yeast for distilling because it gives a weird taste to whatever you're making, but people still use it to try to push the proofing on it, which is funny because you're distilling and you're concentrating anyways. But most people say stick with the stuff that hits yeast die at right about 15%.
Yep.
So that's why beer maxes out somewhere. Well,
right.
Same thing with wine when it ferments. So you can push it a little more, but it's not as good as doing it the old slow-fashioned way.
Yeah, and the juice isn't worth the squeeze, really, at that point.
Yeah. So anyway, that's my rant. That's my soapbox for that. I can get about that. I will just to go back to the other lab shopping stuff. It's rampant. It's everywhere. I mean, the amount of times, hell, just the other day, I had somebody tell me that, growers know the half-life of, some of these pesticides in the plants. So they'll just wait, they'll apply them, make sure that half-life is out long enough that when they go to test, it'll be below the levels. Pyrethrin or they just straight out told me, God, I down in Detroit, I did a week didn't go by when somebody didn't show me a little thing. Hey, I'll give you this lab's going to do this for an extra $100 a sample. Still
Yep.
give me what the pass that I want. But, so pesticides is a big problem. Solvents is a big problem. Depending on where you're at, people will fudge metals too. I mean,
That's so silly to me too, because like, I mean, it makes sense, the fudging, the human nature element of it and everything. But like when I think about metals, and like, even though it's like complicated technologically, it's a very simple like method and assay to do. I don't know.
microwave digest. Well, but the funny thing about metals, and I've tried to submit talks to different
Mhm.
organizations, but your test results mean more than just you can sell your stuff.
Right.
Like there's actual steps and processes that your results tell you aren't optimized.
Yep.
So, for example, metals. Usually, if it's lead, mercury, things like that, it's your water. It's almost always your water.
Hmm.
It's your water filters need changed. Something's not going on. You put like I've seen ones where nickel leaches from. They put the wrong uh, line heater in
Oh.
after an RO system. In the RO
Hmm.
system. So if you just for anybody out there, if you use RO water, it will strip plating,
Yeah.
metal plating from parts because the RO process works. So you have to spend the money and get the actual components that are rated for RO systems,
Yeah.
and double check that. Um, but like copper, I mean, just the other day I saw we had somebody come through the lab that was their carts were failing for copper and nickel, and they were trying to blame the lab, trying to blame us.
Of course.
Well, after about a day or so of reruns, I went down. They had sent in an extra empty one before it was pressed
Hmm.
and sealed. I took a very medium plain grade of sandpaper and just did this on the metal component in the middle of the cart,
Yeah.
and it came right off, copper plated, or it was
Wow.
nickel plated
Wow.
copper.
Right.
It
Right.
was,
Right.
and literally, it was. I mean, it was a brush with it. I didn't even try. So they went cheap and bought some shoddy hardware from
Hmm.
overseas, and manufacturing to tolerances, you got to spend the money
That's
because
right.
now that entire batch, and if they, especially if they're tracking lot numbers, which most people don't.
Right.
Um,
Exactly.
but
Quality systems? What?
oh god. But now for saving a couple of bucks on up front, you now got to buy you lost your entire batch of concentrate. You got to throw out that
Hmm.
entire batch of carts because they're all bad. You know, nickel tends to be if you got a new trimming machine.
Ah,
Like if you
yeah.
buy it, same
Okay.
thing with chromium. Because that stuff's in stainless steel. It's on the plating that a lot of these
Hmm.
have, and the outside of that brand new piece of equipment looks nice, shiny, clean, nice lines, everything. Inside has little tags and tabs and welding spots and
Yeah.
drips and drabs that no one notices. So whenever you get some new machinery, run garbage through it,
Yeah.
run
Yeah.
cardboard, run old plant material, whatever. Then, well, for the micro side,
Nah.
um, so if you haven't yet, Jason, have you heard of Yasha Khan?
Yeah, I'm actually interviewing him on Thursday.
Take a look. You'll love his data.
Yeah.
He got FOIA data from basically Metric for every state except Pennsylvania. Somehow Pennsylvania beat him on it, but it's from 2019 to 2023,
Yeah.
and it is very obvious to see who is cheating and who is not.
Yep. Yep.
I mean, any state regulators that want to get a hold of it, he's giving it away free, and it is blatantly obvious who is cheating. Um, especially on the micro, which the Well, why don't we start with what's the good spot? Where do you want to start with micro? Because it's such an
Let's
all-encompassing
let's
area that I mean,
yeah.
there's so many ways to tweak
T-
it,
to
touch on it.
start, I think it'd be good to break down the, three or so primary sort of assays that labs are doing and the differences between them in case people aren't familiar, because I think people just think like, okay, you're testing DNA and that's just like it's all the same, sort of thing. And so I think assuming that a lot of our listeners don't know much about how the microbiological testing is done, other than maybe like simple plating, let's break down what are those assays, and then what can go wrong that could be taken advantage of that would lead to lab shopping.
So most states require total yeast and mold. They require total coliforms. And when I say coliforms, that actually means total fecal coliforms.
Yeah.
Then you have DEC and SAL, which is Shiga toxin producing E. coli. If anybody's old enough to remember Jack in the Box outbreaks or the green onions at Chi Chi's, anybody?
Mm-hmm.
Um, it's basically really nasty food poisoning, and salmonella is the same way. And then you have aspergillus, which I think that could be its own episode because I don't agree with
Yes.
aspergillus testing at all. Um, I my mind was changed on that by looking at the data, and I would not stake my scientific reputation on requiring that.
Yeah,
Uh,
I actually agree with you. And we should come back around to that and actually talk about that because I do agree.
I was part of the team that helped get that requirement squashed in Oregon last year. So I feel pretty strongly about it. And then you have aspergillus, and then some states will have listeria or staph or
Mm-hmm.
pseudomonas,
Pseudomonas,
few
yeah.
other things. And then occasionally there's total aerobic, and by aerobic they mean oxygen
Right.
breathing using bacteria. I personally think the total aerobic is a waste of a test and is a pointless test because all that's telling you is there's stuff there.
Right.
This is a living organism. It's going to have bacteria on it. It's going to have fungi on it. It's just unless you're in a clean room situation, to me, total aerobic means nothing.
Yeah.
It just means that there's stuff on. And then there's various other things. So usually, the total counts. So whether it's total aerobic, total yeast and mold, total coliform, those are usually done by either plating or something called most probable number enumeration, which
Mm-hmm.
is basically a very fancy way of saying culture.
Yeah.
They grow it in a broth culture that's put in cards. It's actually based on it's called well, back in the day it was called a biotech,
Yeah,
and
yeah.
they used them in clinical labs. And then they ported it over to this, and it shines a light through these cards and these holes in these cards, and it takes a reading of the UV spectrum
Mm-hmm.
that goes through it at a certain wavelength, and they use that to correlate to a count of bacteria in that culture. And then anything that's specific, aspergillus, uh, uh, STEC, or salmonella, those are usually done by qPCR these days.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes they're done by DNA microarrays, which is very similar to that gene chip that I mentioned earlier.
Mm-hmm.
But qPCRs, DNA based. It's quick. It's usually about 2 hours usually
Yeah.
for most of the commercial. And they're very. I mean, there's probably some cons for everything, but I guess the thing. We'll start with the cultures. So cultures have been the gold standard since the Victorian age
Yeah.
because they work. They're repeatable. Everything's been set up. Everything has been described. I mean, there's very little that has not been done in culture and set up in this manner. I mean, most of the stuff is ported from either the USDA or clinical labs. One of the biggest companies that supplies cannabis labs now from the micro side is bioMérieux, which is, if I remember right, is born out of the Pasteur Institute in the 1800s.
Yeah.
So
Way
they
back.
By the way, if you ever get to go to an ASM event and BioMary is throwing a party, make sure you go.
Nice. Good heads up.
They get that good pharmaceutical clinical money, and I it would have been, I think 2006 they rented out the entire Hard Rock Cafe in Atlanta,
Oh,
and
wow.
and they were supposed to go to like 10:30, 11, 10, and I'm standing at the bar for last call, and this guy walks up and said, "Hey, one of our guys, one of the big, apparently one of the pharma clinical companies wanted it to stay open." So he drops an unlabeled black card on the thing and said, "Keep it going until midnight."
No, it's got the black card.
I was like,
Wow. Unlimited credit.
okay,
Here we go.
wow. But the thing with plates, so most of the bacteria that we're talking about in cannabis is usually like a 24 overnight grow time.
Hmm.
Fungi is a little different. Fungi are known for growing slower.
Yeah.
Yeast you can usually get in, but like if for actual fungi, usually when you're growing them up for physical ID under a microscope, we're talking 2 weeks plus. Uh, so it is very, very difficult and borderline on, again, and you're riding the edge of what's physically possible to get it
Hmm.
done in under 3 days.
Yeah.
I've seen 48-hour protocols for some plates. I do not, they don't work. They're too inconsistent at that time. I know they're approved, but I get visibly different results at 48 hours versus 72 hours. It is
Yep.
fact. It statistically, it might, but statistics, I still remember in high school, I was in 11th grade, and when I pulled a book off the library shelf in the school library, and it was titled "How to Lie with Statistics."
Yeah. Yeah.
That has stuck with me ever since. But the thing with plates, depending on what kind of plating they use, a lot of people are moving away to most probable, most probable number enumeration,
Yeah.
MPN. I'm just going to shorten that and
Hmm.
say,
Yeah. Yeah.
most people use MPN now because it is trained monkey proof.
Hmm.
You don't have, because when you get these plates, you literally have to count the number of
Right.
colonies on. And the when I say plates, a lot of people in the industry are using this thing called 3M Petri film.
Yep.
And it's most people, when they think agar plates, they think the Petri dish with the stuff in it and you're counting it. What Petri film is they basically take a very, very, very thin layer of that agar
Yeah.
and they put it onto a little card with a plastic sheet over it. When it's time to use it, you lift up that plastic sheet, you add 1 milliliter of your thing you want to check, then you put the plastic sheet back down, and you're supposed to take this little stamp thing that they give you and
Yep.
set it on it so it's spread nice and evenly across this round circular setup.
With no bubbles or anything.
No bubbles or anything, not going outside the lines or
Yeah.
whatever. And then you put it in an incubator and let it sit for 3 days. The problem with that is that it almost never stays in the line when you press it.
Hmm.
If your pH is off at all,
Yes.
it
Yes.
throws
Yeah.
off your test completely. If you're, depending on which one you're using and what media you're using and what organism you're looking for, uh, greater than 2 degrees off either way, your assay is bunk.
Yeah.
If you're pulling it out at 10 hours versus 15 hours, or 48 hours versus 72 hours,
Hmm.
the results are completely different. And also, if it dries out at all,
Yeah.
and this is where the lab shopping and the cheating. This is one of the ways the cheating is that if it dries out, a lot of times those look like colonies. So what
Mm.
happens is people will say, "Oh, that's just dried out," and they'll cut off an entire part of
Ah.
their
Uh-huh.
thing. A lot of times too, depending on what dilution you're using, you should be aiming for any plating setup, whatever dilution you're aiming for. You should want between 10 and 100 colonies on that plate.
Yes.
That is
Yeah.
your
Yeah.
target.
Right.
Any
Right.
more than that, it's hard to count, and
Right.
less than that, and because bacteria are so small, logarithmic,
Right.
it
You'll be way
fluctuates.
off when it
I
scales.
could,
Yeah.
yeah, it could be technically 10 to the fifth CFUs. So, 100,000 CFUs. I played it at 10 to the fifth dilution, and I could, on one plate, I could have one colony. On another one, I could have 10, just because it wasn't mixed. So it
Right.
throws
Right.
things off. But a lot of times too, if it's high, what they'll do is they'll cut the plate in half visually or into
Hmm.
quarters visually, and they'll pick a quadrant and they'll multiply it by. So if it's half, they multiply by 2. If it's a quadrant, they'll do it by 4. And you can just
Yeah.
pick the smaller quadrant. There you
Right.
go. Now, not to completely shit on Petri film,
Yeah.
um, it it was originally designed for the meat packing industry.
That's
It was
right.
a
Yeah.
way to quickly screen for O157H7 E. coli, salmonella, things like that. And they're going through thousands of
That's
pounds
right.
a day, and it's a great quick screening tool. It is not, in my opinion, sufficient for this industry, just because if you have a trained microbiologist running these things, maybe.
Right.
Personally, I hate them. I despise setting them up. It never works. Half the time, it'll tear. You got to get a new one. The auger pops up when it shouldn't, and then
Hmm.
I just use plates. Hardy Chrome's uh, compact dry plates actually are.
Well, I was
This
gonna
is
say
not.
you can get the pre-made plates. Like
Yeah,
it's not for all of the ease of the 3M Petri film, it is just as easy
and
to
it's
to
not a
use
little
proper
cheaper.
plates. Yeah,
It's actually
exactly.
probably a little cheaper, but I really actually like the compact dry plates. They're even a little smaller than the Petri film cards,
Hmm.
but they actually have a lid on them. They're actually like
Do,
mini
do, do they have the
Petri dishes.
built-in grids? I
Yep,
like the ones that have the built-in grids. Yeah.
yep. It's a built-in
Hmm.
grid, and another reason why I like lids is you can tell if there's contamination from the lab a little easier if there's a lid on it and
Yeah,
it's set up like an actual plate, because usually contamination is around the edges,
that's right. Yeah.
and if it clumps, you can kind of tend to, it's a little easier to
It's a
diagnose.
visual cue. Yeah.
And I would say more with the cheating is more with the coliforms on that one than the
Hmm.
total use of mold, although total use rampant. A lot of times they just, well, they just say it's not whatever the action limit is, it's just under.
Exactly.
Um,
Whatever it is.
we
Yeah.
just we just pick, and yeah. Um, and then for the PCR is extremely well. I mean, I have people that complain about the assay and the assay's no good. The assays are absolutely fine.
Hmm.
PCR, I mean, has been around decades now. This is not new technology. We are not special. Cannabis is not special. We like
Yeah.
to think we're special. We are not special. We've been testing agricultural products for decades.
Yeah.
We've been testing pesticides on produce for decades. This is
And
not a
way
new.
more than we test on cannabis.
Oh God, that's the whole thing. Yeah,
Yeah.
when I tell people a standard FDA foodborne panel is 15 to 20 organisms compared to the 3 they get checked now, they get a little
A little
terrified.
nervous.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But the thing with PCR, I mean, there's kids in high schools, in middle schools
That's
running
right.
PCR right now. All a PCR is, it's a DNA photocopier. That's
That's
it.
right. That's a good way to put it. Yeah.
There's a fluorescent tag on it, so the more copies you have, the brighter the fluorescence is. That's literally it. But it is extremely specific to that DNA sequence. Now, the thing with this, a lot of the companies don't tell you what that sequence is or what they're targeting, or even the region or gene, which is completely alien to me, because this is absolutely a thing from the clinical side. You know what gene they're targeting, you know what area it is. Hell, most of them, a good chunk of them have the sequence on there
Right.
because it's you clinical.
Critical. Yeah. It's like
Yeah,
you
yeah,
you
yeah.
you have to have it in order to
Which,
verify these things.
and the thing with knowing that is that DNA, as much as people just like to think it's just DNA, there's a lot of things that go into designing a PCR. Like you got to be worried about the structure of the DNA, how the DNA clumps when you're
Mm-hmm.
running. You've got to know how big it is. There's a whole line of things. Um, which again, it's trivial to put one of these things together. Putting together a good one, it takes more work, but at the same time, it's one of the easiest tests to run in the lab. The
Mm-hmm.
problem comes from the sampling of getting the correct representative sample to go through. And, you know, especially with aspergillus, making it a plus minus one spore, one DNA strand. I guess that's my problem with some of the, especially with the aspergillus one, is that the assays are almost too sensitive, or
Yeah.
the
Yeah.
requirements are set too. But with DNA and PCR, the ways you can screw with that really easily. Well, there's always the dry labbing with the computer programs. You can set
Right.
the bar of where it calls a positive is called a crossing point. It's CP or CQ, usually
Mm-hmm.
crossing point. Um, and it's an arbitrary line where it the curve goes exponential. Basically, when your PCR is running, double. It's every time it doubles, and
Yep.
eventually you hit a point in that doubling where it's exponential growth, and that's what they call a positive when it crosses that point there. That's the line.
Right.
But you shift that line where it calls it. That's one thing. If the usually you have to take the flour or whatever, and you have to put it into a bag, and you add buffer or
Mm-hmm.
some
Yeah.
kind
Yeah.
of thing to get it in suspension. And then, well, if that buffer's pH is off, if that buffer has salt concentrations that are off, if there is, there's any number of things that you can do to tweak it on the back end as well as on the computer end.
Yeah.
And sometimes if it's a little wonk, if the curve doesn't look like the textbook picture,
Mm-hmm.
it gets tossed out. There's a whole bunch of other little things that come in there. Um, I think that hits on most of them. Basically, it's
Yeah.
either, I mean, it's the range of how people goes from just straight up fudging the numbers, we call it dry labbing,
Right.
to you can set it up so nothing's going to fail just by tweaking the buffers
Yeah.
or nothing. Yeah.
And it's fascinating going back to you mentioned Yasha's data. When you look at some of that data that he put together, you can see some interesting trends in the aspergillus detection rates,
Yep.
depending on the states you look at and the labs you look at within each state. And you find some labs that have basically zero detections, and then some as high as, close to 10% or so. And that's a very wide variance.
Well,
And we definitely expect to see some variability in terms of where you are in the country, the season. There is some seasonality.
there's very big season, especially when
Yeah, but that variability doesn't account for the amount of variability
two
that
percent
we
fail
see.
rate compared to a 15% fail rate for the state average. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. So there's obviously some things going on there. There's obviously, and I guess one thing I wanted to ask you, because how much of this do you think is outright deliberate, and how much of it is a consequence of just poorly equipped, untrained staff?
Good question. Um, I would probably say, I would go for the 80-20 rule on that one. I would say
Hmm.
20% is people deliberately fudging things.
Hmm.
It
Yeah,
might creep up to and pressure on the industry in that area to like 30-40%, I could see, but I would say the majority of it is people just aren't trained. I
I
mean,
agree.
even if you look at the any of the new undergraduate degrees that are popping up with cannabis
Hmm.
testing or the cannabis science or cannabis business, they almost always focus just on the chemistry side.
Right.
They
Yeah.
might toss in PCR, but having a bunch of chemists to molecular biology, they have some very bad habits. And the big thing with, uh, especially with very sensitive, is aspergillus. We'll use that as an example.
Yeah.
Aspergillus is everywhere. We breathe in over hundreds of spores a day, just walking around outside, at
Right.
least. It is everywhere. If I go into your facility, I'm guaranteeing I can find it somewhere.
Yeah.
So most microbiology sections and departments of cannabis labs that I have been to are, let's say, not ideal.
Hmm.
You know, if you're doing culturing and setups, you should be in at a biosafety cabinet
Right.
because it laminar flow, it keeps things out. PCR should be at minimum set up in a dry box, so there's no air coming in and you're not breathing on the tubes and all that. But there is a lot of cross contamination, and I feel like a lot of people will say, "Oh, that's contamination from the lab," and wash that result away. But I've taken swabs from ventilation in microbial
Mm.
areas of cannabis labs. They hit positive for aspergillus. They hit positive
Yeah.
for God knows what other. You just do a straight settle plate where you just take a auger plate, take the top off for
Hmm.
15 minutes, put it back on, and then incubate it. You would be shocked at the counts that come out of some of those places.
And it's funny you mentioned settle plates. I have had such a hard time convincing labs to do something as simple as just putting out settle plates.
Just
To
basic
do
environmental monitoring.
it's just basic, just like how clean is your air? And there's all sorts of ways you can look at it, but that is like the absolute simplest way. Just open the the petri dish, just set it out for a while, and then close it back up, incubate
And
it, and
check on
look.
it in 3 days. I mean, it's yeast and
Exactly.
mold, so as long as it's 70 room temperature, you're fine. Just check it in 3 to 5 days.
Right. Yeah. It's something that, and I guess this is eventually where I'd like to bring the conversation to too, is like some practical things that labs can be doing to kind of improve quality. And this is one both producers and testing labs should be listening to and thinking about. Settle plates, such a basic thing. Just get a basic sense of your air quality, what is moving around, where in your facility, because you're going to find hotspots. Like that's something I've definitely noticed. You've got these
Yep.
like heavy bio load areas, where's your garage door you're rolling up to bring in product, all sorts of stuff like that.
What's your airflow? Is it positive, negative going into a
Yeah,
room? Yeah. I mean, I always tell people cannabis and no one wants to spend the money on it. I try to at least get them to do 3 to 6 months so they have a general base, especially for the indoor guys.
yeah,
Outdoor guys, that's a whole other thing. And for the indoor guys, at least to get a baseline, because just because you have a high aerobic or settle plate count doesn't necessarily mean your facility is bad,
yeah,
but you need to know the baseline so that if you do have issues, you can then spot check with some new settle plates. See, has my count gone up? Has it gone
right.
down? What's wrong? Is it bad or worse in this area than it is on this area? It gives you that extra tool to be able to say, okay, I can pinpoint where my issues are.
Yep.
And that's
And to just know if something has changed, it's like you don't, if you're not studying your own conditions and variability, then, and this relates to something I mentioned in my talk at ACS on
mm-hmm.
monitoring variability. But like if you're not monitoring it and you have no sense of what's causing what, then you get into the system where you're just reacting all the time to fires and trying to put out fires without any sort of sense of what's driving
and
the foundational issues.
and if you're going for GMP or
Right.
GLP, ISO 9001, you're required by that certification and accreditation to do environmental monitoring.
That's right. Yep.
So this is an easy way to take care of that because
And cheap.
plates are
So cheap.
dirt cheap and it's counting them. It's just
It's
counting
like,
a colony.
yeah, I mean, it's anybody can be trained to do it, to the extent of just trying to see what's our bioload.
It's
And if it
about,
reaches a certain point, we need to take some action of some sort.
yeah,
Very
10, 15
straightforward.
minutes, you could train somebody how to do this.
Yeah.
It's just making sure you get the right place.
Yep.
And that's it.
Yeah. Yep.
Yeah.
Well, and I guess, yeah, let's bring the conversation around to the positive, optimistic side, I guess, in a sense. uh, because I have mixed feelings about testing in general. I agree with you that like when we start to look at the data, there's probably a lot of testing we're doing that's unnecessary or not really. I wouldn't say unnecessary. Everything has some value depending on how you look at it, but is it like protecting people or adding some layer of safety? I don't know. And as Kyle Boyer presented at the ACS conference, it was nice to see this idea of like, okay, we spent all this time talking about aspergillus. But like, what about some of the other stuff that we actually have
Oh,
some
absolutely.
data on that we're seeing do pop up in cannabis products more frequently than aspergillus that we don't test for at all?
So back in 2018, when I was first talking to people, I was originally told, and however much of this is true or not, I don't know because most of these states just copy and pasted the legislation
That's
as they
right.
go across
Yep.
and didn't think about it going forward. Um, not to knock on the states, but I mean, if you're gonna, why reinvent the wheel? I get
That's
it.
right. Yeah. Yeah.
Um, but thing, I was originally told that total yeast and mold was the quick and dirty to test for aspergillus, which was the quick and dirty to test for mycotoxins because mycotoxins weren't required in a lot of states at that
Right.
time. First, the way I look at it is if you're doing the total yeast and mold to kind of catch all everything and see how high the load is versus and the mycotoxins, you cover your bases. There's no point to have the aspergillus in the middle because you're already bracketing it.
Hmm.
Um, Especially since it's such a ubiquitous everywhere pathogen. I couldn't even find an LD50 for it when I looked,
Yeah.
or an ID50. I couldn't find an ID50 for aspergillus anywhere. In my old clinical textbooks, it basically said, oh, they have an aspergillus infection. They must be HIV positive, undiagnosed. That's all they cared about. It was undiagnosed immunocompromised.
Right. 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 Because it's a big sign that like if you're getting infected, you basically do not have a well functioning
Yep.
immune system. Yeah.
And especially with some document or some publications by Dr. Zamir Punja,
Yeah.
uh,
Yeah.
he is part of our packet that we supply to the state of Oregon. Um, in order to actually have aspergillus produce mycotoxins, you have to have a water activity of like 0.88, zero 0.9, and it has to be like 85, 90 degrees
Yeah.
consistent. And then you have to have a fungal load of like basically you can see it growing on the flower.
Yeah.
You can so it in actual grow and with an actual water activity, a dried sample,
Hmm.
properly cured, you're never. I would think it's actually going to be difficult to find it
Well, I
ever.
can I can comment on that just from my own experience. Like when I was in Oregon doing testing back in 20, sort of in like 2015 or so, I started running just like internally for R&D these like very simple qualitative mycotoxin tests, just over under,
Mm-hmm.
runs just to kind of see. And I had one sample, one flower sample that had visible mold on it. I did a plate and it blew up
Mm-hmm.
and with these very gnarly, looking colonies that we don't normally see. And I was like, this is actually a good candidate. Like, let's run this. And that was the only flower
Mm-hmm.
sample I ever actually, qualitatively measured any substantial mycotoxin load on. And it was a flower sample that no one would ever consume.
And that's the thing is that by the time this flower actually gets anywhere, it is mush. Like
Hmm.
it dissolves because the bacteria or the fungi are actively destroying it. I mean, it's never going to make it to shelf. Anybody who looks at it be like, I'm not touching that. I've similarly, I think in 6 years I've seen three
Yeah.
maybe. And although I will point out that being in Oregon, you guys had it a little different since most of you guys were outdoor grows compared to
Right.
indoor grows everywhere else,
Yeah.
which just makes it, if you're outdoor growing, there's a good chance you're going to fail for total yeast and mold. It's just because it's,
Hmm.
anyway. But I
Especially
will,
with the culture of like regenerative agriculture and everything in Oregon as well. People.
ironically, I actually saw some of the guys in Oregon when they were having trouble with the aspergillus fails when it first kind of got in
Hmm.
where it got was that there was a group of guys that went and completely nuked their soil. They started from scratch. and they rebuilt it. And as they rebuilt it, they actually saw fewer and fewer aspergillus fails as their soil got healthier and healthier, to the point where he wasn't failing at all. Which I told him, I kept telling him to write it down what you did, write it down, because that's a huge that's huge. That's papers, that's scientific papers you could be publishing on that.
And it's something looking back on now. I wish, I wish we had all of the data from back then, because, when that issue started to get a lot of news attention, I started thinking back and I was like, while I know it is an issue, I know plenty of growers growing outdoors that were doing, organic cultivation, all this sort of stuff, using compost teas and everything, that never failed. And so I'm like, I know it can be done.
Yeah. Oh, it's mostly, these are living plants. And to go back to your point of, are we testing for certain things? Should we be testing for less? Should we? I put a white paper out on those 5 years of testing data from 3 different two labs that I was a part of in Michigan. I was a lab director for another one as an intro, and mine. And we saw 70 to 80% of all pesticides were 2 pesticides.
Yeah.
But Eagle 20 and
Another one of the pyrethroids, or
it was bifenthrin or
pyprinobutoxide will usually show up at those fumigants they use.
Yeah,
to cleanse the rooms.
And then the other problem is too, this guy just plants a soil remediator. If it's there, it'll pull up. So if you're anywhere outdoors near like an apple orchard,
that's right. Yeah.
Any other kind of crops, you're going to fail for pesticides. Just spray over, it will be there. Yeah. But there was probably 20 to 40% of those pesticides that never once popped. Now, should we still continue to look at them just in case somebody decides? Like, it's one of those things, right? If you stop testing for it, are they just going to look at the list and pick one of those ones then to use? Or are they...
Right.
And again, is it our responsibility? We're not, like I said earlier at the beginning, we're not cops. We're here to keep you honest, but we're not cops.
I think that going back to that point, I think that is a very critical thing to highlight, because this was an issue that ran through my mind constantly when I was working in the commercial testing labs, that I would repeat to people. It's like, we are not agents of the state. We are not the police. We are third-party independent companies. And but we get thrust in this position, this weird, in this
semi-regulatory,
weird tug of war, where it's like, my data has such influence on your company, that it creates these very strange dynamics, which is what leads to some of the incentives for
and I will even
lab
throw
shopping.
Out too, from my standpoint, worst part of my day is telling people they fail. Not only because I hate giving people bad news, but my test results could either make you thousands of dollars or cost you thousands of dollars at the low end, right?
Right.
People don't realize, if you go into a hospital right now and you get your blood pressure checked, or you get a blood draw for whatever condition you have, when you get those test results, you don't scream at your doctor how they're wrong, they're idiots, they don't know what they're doing, and you go find another doctor and keep doing that until you find one that gives you the result you want. If it's especially like cholesterol, if you're getting your cholesterol checked, you don't go to another doctor, get another test to say your cholesterol's right until you get one. That's the way the cannabis lab is. And, if I fail somebody, I lose that customer. There's a good chance, a lot of them come back in 6 months or so, but the labs are in a really hard position with, it's tough to say what the solution is, because until there's some kind of control put on it, and having individual states make their own reference lab is a huge part of this. FDA regulation, huge part of this, and will solve some of these problems. But, I am not saying you shouldn't be able to shop around and find the lab you want. That is absolutely not what I'm saying. But there's a reality that we're dealing with right now is that the industry is so hamstrung on how they can make money at all. I would that whenever I mean, there is enormous pressure on you to pass people because you will go out of business if you don't.
Yeah. Yep.
And I mean, it's bad enough that I would say anybody who is a part of a lab owns a lab or whatever that's listening to this, I would guarantee that they have an outstanding uh, they have outstanding uh, payments that are due to them of
Yeah.
at minimum 20 grand.
Yeah.
Every single lab out there at minimum is owed 20 grand by various people that they just don't pay. And, Michigan is at least starting up a thing where if you have outstanding debts, like major outstanding debts, or you aren't collections and things like that, they're going to not renew your license.
Yeah.
Which finally,
Right.
I mean,
right. Because I mean, that's part of this issue is that a lot of there's just virtually no enforcement. There's like vague threats of like you might lose your license or something, but that's been one of the big parts is there's been no bite to a lot of this.
and
Yeah.
a lot of the states, again, I give people credit for setting up programs. I give Michigan's CRA, I give them credit. They've done a very good job, especially with the limited information they have. Colorado's the same. I've given credit. California, whatever they're calling their agency these days, they started out okay. They royally messed that up. And the fact that it takes over almost 2 years to get approval from them is just ass. But because there were no PTs, because there were no official programs, and you can't ship it through the mail or through across state borders, they had to come up with other solutions. So, like for Michigan, the original solution was they would do checks. So they would call up one lab. They would pick a specific metric tag number. The lab would then divvy that up into portions for all the other labs. The other labs would then come to that location, pick up their sample, and go and test it, and then report that to the CRA. Can anybody else see the conflict of interests that could possibly be in this? Because I mean, you're having a competitor prep your sample.
Yep.
I mean, that I don't like these guys. I think they're screwing with me. I think they're whatever. I can spike their sample when it's being negative.
Right. Yep.
And then they're going to look like they don't know what they're doing. You do that enough times, you're going to get called and you're going to get your audits. You're going to get your inspections. Where having a state lab that randomly show up at your door, say, I want this metric tag right now, then take it and leave it and go back to the state lab and check it, I think is huge. But, without being able to do some of those normal things that scientific industries and the lab industry has been able to do for any other thing, adds to that compounding problem of, well, we're just kind of going we're going out of business.
Yeah.
280Es and too.
That's
but like
right.
we can't get SBA loans. We can't get small business loans that most everybody else does. I once gave a talk at a conference down in Florida, and it was CEO talk, and the title was, how do you run an analytical testing business in an industry that doesn't want accurate testing?
Right. That's good. Yeah.
And as I was going through it, I started up with, okay, so here's the problems that the labs have to come up with immediately. Most companies and most investors don't want to fork out $2 to $3 million up front and then have 6 months to a year plus of no revenue coming in. That's a hard sell for anybody. But in a lab, if you don't have that $2 to $3 million up front, you don't have equipment, you don't have validated assays, you don't have trained staff. You need all of that up front.
Not to
And
mention, it's going to take you months and months and months to actually validate, get licensed, do all of these things once you have the facility ready and the equipment ready and the people there.
I usually tell people plan for 6 months to a year.
That's
Give
right.
yourself a runway for validation, getting money.
Yep.
It's if you're good and you've done it a few times, you probably get it closer to that 6 months. But if you're talking to investors, give yourself at least another 3 months on top of that, just to give yourself some breathing room, because they're going to be on your back.
That's
And
right.
avoid VC as much.
Yeah.
Um, just just as a tip. But yeah, we're stuck in this weird thing, and I'll tell you right off the bat, with the amount of testing that is required in most states require pesticides, solvents, potency, at least four different microbials.
Hmm.
There's three PCRs, your two cultures. They require your heavy metals, mycotoxins, and some of them require terpenes, whatever. Um, a full panel, the lab's break even is between $250 and $300, depending on where they're at.
Yeah.
So, like, all these states and growers, like, I feel for you guys. Yeah, $300, but the percentage that the lab testing is out
Hmm.
of your entire batch, it's so minuscule that hearing you guys complain about it really kind of, it gets old. I mean, I
Well, it's
get
it's
it.
hard.
You want
It's
to save
hard.
money.
It's
It's really
hard when
hard. I
when a
agree.
lab is operating at like -5% margins at times. It's
And
really
then we're not getting
hard.
paid, or people leave when we give them bad news. And it's like, guys, I can't drop below $300. I have to be able to stay in business. We're not making exorbitant salaries out here.
No.
Chances are the executives at your company are making more than anybody at the lab.
Exactly. Yeah. Just because there's a lot of expensive lab equipment around doesn't mean anybody's making money.
But I mean, the labs, you gotta, like I said, you're rough, especially nowadays, for barely just enough to run everything. You're looking at $1.5 to $2 million just for the equipment. Then you
Hmm.
have to keep your service contracts on all these equipment, which is
Yep.
15% of the purchase price per year, 10
Yep.
to 15%. Then we have to buy certified reference materials, which is
And
not
usually
just
two
going,
sources.
yep, yep. And you've got to have backups. You've got to have your CRMs for your check standards, which is different from your standard curves. So, and then you have to buy everything from most the vast majority of them have to be some form of ISO 9001 or ISO 17025 or GMP, because your accreditation requires that. Your accreditation then is anywhere between $8,000 and $25,000, depending on who and what you're getting done
Hmm.
every year. That is a full audit plus your desk audit on the off years.
And we haven't talked about annual licensing fees just to stay in
Oh God.
business.
Oh God, yeah. So I mean, in order to actually operate a bare minimum lab, I've done this. I've done these budgets for 6 years now. It's gone up a little bit with inflation, but you're sitting at between $1 to $1.5 million.
Yeah.
That's just to keep the doors open. That is not retest. That is literally just to have the people paid, trained, credited, and you're running. Because those machines got to be on, and those standards have to run every day that you want to do tests.
Yep.
I mean, you have to minimum run the check standards. Depending on what it is, I don't like to go more than a week with any of my standard curves. Some of them I run them every day. I
Hmm.
I think you're gonna the
There's
standards are gonna
there's
go bad before I run out. So
and there's environmental variability too that'll cause baseline shift and
yep.
stuff that you don't always pick up on unless you're
And
kind
then
of monitoring that
and then
every
there's
day.
waste removal, there's certifications. All my pipettes have to be calibrated every year.
Yes, the
Some of them are,
balances.
oh my God,
Yes.
the balances, the pipettes. Some of the pipettes you can get away with 2 years, but like, you know, I can't just go to Amazon and buy this stuff. I can't just
Hmm.
go to eBay and buy stuff. I have to, because of the accreditations that we're required to have, we have to buy them in specific places. So, like I said, it costs a lab to function bare minimum 1 to 1.5 mil. And actually, there's a paper out of UC Davis. I think it's UC Davis. Uh, Way back, it was probably about 5 years ago, 4 or 5 years ago, that they actually went through, and it was the cost of cannabis compliance testing.
Oh,
I'll send it
nice,
to you.
nice.
I'll send
Yeah.
it to you. I've saved it, but there's my staffing, in order to have decent staffing, that's 50 to 60% of your cost right up
Yeah.
front. So tack that on to the maintenance contracts, all that, the spare parts, columns, So when you run a potency test, it's not usually on an HPLC or a
Mm-hmm.
um, or basically HPLC stands for high pressure liquid chromatography, which is a fancy way of saying pumps through a divider, and,
Yep.
and it gets registered by whatever.
Yep. Take
But this
pressurized
column,
liquid, shove it through a small tube, and shine light on it.
just like heavy metals, are a fancy arc welder or plasma torch connected to a mass spectrometer.
That's right.
I mean, it's an argon welder. But those columns cost $900 each.
Yep.
Then you've got a guard column that goes on it because cannabis is dirty and there's a lot of garbage that goes through it, even if you clean it up and filter. So, and those, you get 3 guard columns for roughly $600-700, depending on where you get it from. Those last for 1 to 3 months, depending on how much you're going through that column and what samples are going through it. If you don't have that guard column, you're going through that actual column
Yep.
anywhere between 9 months.
Yeah, sometimes even shorter, depending on what you're shoving through there.
And that's just one.
Yeah.
So you've got if you've got a multiple HPLCs, you've got one for each of those and for the LCs. And then God forbid you blow a seal on something. those sapphire pistons that they're making.
Yeah.
I mean, we've got most of everything is set up to run with helium as a carrier gas, and I don't know if anybody's tried to buy helium.
Yep. There is a massive helium shortage going on, or at least there has been. I don't know if anything's
Well,
changed with
there's
that.
actually a black market going between hospitals now
Wow,
for
really?
transferring helium back and forth because it's so expensive and it's so hard to get in some places. So hospitals actually have a secondary market trading helium for the MRI.
That is wild, wild, wow.
So, and also just so everybody knows, a decent HPLC, not a cut rate one, you're looking at $45,000 plus brand new, and then that doesn't include installation fees in setting it up and getting it certified. A decent LC triple quad, which you have to run pesticides and mycotoxins, $250,000 to $350,000 just to get it in the door. An ICP-MS, you're looking at $180,000 to $200,000 to get in the door. That also doesn't include the gas wiring, the lines, the bench tops, and the consumables. So, just that operation is huge.
And not to mention the power. The power to run everything costs money.
Oh God, yeah. And keeping it air conditioned, because for example, a lot of times if you're running residual solvents, a lot of times people do it with headspace. But because some of the boiling point of solvents is so low, you have to be able to maintain the 65 degrees in that laboratory all day, every day. Otherwise, you can't run the machine because it can't get low enough. It has to go 1 or 2 degrees lower to get so it can ramp up, and you can't run solvent. I used to, God, that before I got things cleaned up at Abco, we had to run solvents first thing in the morning in the summer.
Oh yeah, yeah.
Because the AC was going out on it. It was in Warren.
Get it done while we can.
It basically, once you hit noon, it couldn't get below time, especially with all the equipment running in that same area.
Yep.
God forbid you blow a turbo pump on one of those. So for a mass spec, there's an
Basically a jet
initial pump
engine
to get it down to a certain point, and then to get the proper vacuum level stabilized, they have very, very, very expensive pump that goes on top of that. And those are roughly $80,000, if I remember right. The last quote I got for one was about 65 4 years ago.
Yeah.
That'd be about right. So it sucks. We're in the same spot as most of the rest of the cannabis industry, as we're not making money either. And the only labs that are started off, or at least there's a good portion of them, I'm not going to say all of them, because there's a good portion of them that got that way by cheating. And it, at the very minimum, started out that way and then stopped. And now, but everybody still thinks. So, I mean, I don't have the answer to fix it.
Yeah, I mean, one thing that comes to my mind just as we're breaking down all of these costs is the value of cooperation
Mhm.
between labs in terms
Oh, I
of,
am big on having that. I'm competitive, but I want
Mhm.
to be friendly because you never know, right?
Well, and then, all of these labs. So one thing that was interesting from my experience getting started in all of this is that the first lab that we built, Cannabis Research, we built it with basically nothing. We had no funding, very little, resources, renting a labs like 400 square foot lab space from a, biotech company that happened to have the space available. And the way that we were able to grow is we had a partner that was an agricultural lab that
Hmm.
was ISO accredited that could do the full agricultural pesticide panel. We were great friends with them. So we were like, why would we rush to buy an LC triple quad and a GC triple
Hmm.
quad when we have this partner that can fill this role while we're trying to get ourselves going,
We
trying
started
to
the same
save
way.
money. And yeah, and so this idea of having a network of people that you can contract things to in order to build those services so that you can build a little more sustainably so that you don't feel so much pressure and so that your overhead is not so high. Um, I learned a lot from that experience. And then I've also worked in labs that were started by people with tons of money that didn't really know much about labs, but knew what a lab is supposed to look like. And I call it the John Hammond syndrome from Jurassic Park. Spare no expense. And these are the
Oh yeah, I
people
know
that,
those ones. Yep,
they're already $2-3 million deep. They've gotten the best equipment they could get, but they have no idea what they're doing and they're bleeding money.
and they also were told it was the best equipment. It wasn't the best equipment.
Exactly, exactly. They were told by these reps of these companies that this is what you need to get. This is the standard. This is top of the line. And they often don't even have the conception that I could have done this a totally different way where I wouldn't have this overhead and I wouldn't have all of these burdens hanging over me where now I've got to figure out how I'm going to convince our investors that we're going to recoup $3 million when we've been operating for a year and a half and don't have any clients yet. Um, it's something that I hope anyone operating labs here's this. Like, there are other ways to do things. Like, you don't have to jump into it and carry the full burden all at once. And you don't even have to be a full, like, you don't have to do all the tests. You don't have to do everything. What you need are resources. You need connections to people that you trust, that you're willing to go to court with their data. Because that's what this all boils down to is any data you're giving to a client, you better be prepared to go to court with it.
Absolutely. And
Otherwise,
I've
what
been
are
an
you
expert
doing?
witness for several of those cases, and one of the first things I look at is the lab results, COAs. I mean, they're usually the first point to hit on the, oh, well, this is garbage results. It tanks your
Right.
case.
Right. Exactly. Yeah, exactly. So in terms of like practical solutions, I think that's one that a lot of labs should start to think about if they're feeling that burden and they're like, I'm operating negative margins, all these things. Like there are alternative operational strategies to take.
So I think there's two ways to go about it. I actually started similar the way you did because my investors were uh, like ones. And we had to find partners to do some of
Yeah.
this outsourcing. And then, granted, it helped that we were hemp and we could ship over state lines, which
Hmm.
had its own little pitfalls. But um, we didn't have the money to get a triple quad right away.
Right.
So we would ship it out, and it's also a good policy to have backups because if your
Yes,
machines go down, depending on your service contract, you might not see a rep for 3 days unless you know how to fix
that's
it
right.
yourself, which I recommend everybody that ever owns a lab, you need to have somebody on site that at least sits there and watches everything those technicians do and knows those big pieces of equipment inside and out because they can take care of most of the general maintenance themselves
Yeah.
and you only have to call in for the big guys, every once in a while. But the other option, and this is actually the way I prefer it, is especially if you have the full suite of equipment, why are you just dosing cannabis?
Yes. Yes. Thank you for saying that. Yes.
Diversify. I mean,
Like it is such a poor use of your assets at that point.
you have equipment that some universities and testing labs dream of having.
Yep.
Like having a top of the line UPLC triple quad MS,
The things you can
people
do with it.
dream of that. I mean,
Yeah.
you can
Yeah.
do PFAS, you can do any kind of like I actually this was my talk at ACS was the different equipment that you can use and the different things you can use it for. So, you know, but you are, and especially to get around the whole cannabis thing, I always like to say we're an agricultural testing
That's it. Yeah.
and
Yeah. Yeah.
what that all that entails. So, I mean, generally farms at least, oh God, it's been a while. I don't remember exactly, but 2 to 5 years, they need to do soil sampling,
Right.
nutrient testing, which you've got an HP or you've got an ICP-MS that covers most of the micro macronutrients. I mean, total organic carbon and total nitrogen are kind of a pain in the ass, but at least for the major nutrients,
Mm-hmm.
you can do nutrients. You can do flavonoids and terpenes of other products. The amount
Mm-hmm.
of research, testing that goes into developing new strains of fruit and citrus, it
Yeah.
all comes, I mean, anymore, it's all based on flavor profiles that are popping out of there. Like I was looking at a an LC QTOF.
Oh, nice. Nice. Yeah.
It
The time
tops
of flight.
time of flight. It's basically I personally am a big fan of MALDI-TOF, which is very matrix-assisted laser deabsorption ionization time of flight, which is a big fancy word for saying I shoot a sample with a very high-powered laser and it vaporizes it and throws it down a tube,
That's right.
and then it hits a mass spec.
Yep.
So it's also extreme dirt cheap. It's about 50 cents a sample for most times and take about 10 seconds to run it. And it's used in a lot of big major clinical hospitals anymore for microbial testing and
Mm.
identification. It's almost use of it. But I was looking at an LCQ TOF, $400,000, $450,000, but they had a 980 terpene database
Mm-hmm.
for analysis. You have the entire USDA pesticide database, so
Yeah.
you can be screening produce, just screening with it, but just literally, you have the equipment that you can test damn near anything.
Yeah. Yep.
Use it.
Yeah.
Nutraceuticals. You can do product development. I mean,
That's one
contract
of
R&D.
so again, conversations we try to have with executives, it doesn't always go the way we want, but this is something I've echoed many, many times. If you have all of this equipment, why is your business plan set up so that you're solely reliant on compliance cannabis testing as your only income?
Especially
It's
when it's
it's
as
weird.
volatile as it is.
Yeah, it's weird when you take a step back and you really think about it. And this was something we talked about at ACS, or I'll mention it on here. My relationship to this issue, I've always every lab I've worked in or built, I've always considered it a natural products lab where we specialize in cannabis, but we can do all sorts of other things. I was once in a corporate meeting. Everyone in the company is at this meeting, the president, CEO, everyone, and they're giving talks. And I was a high level position in this company and stood up to give a talk, and I brought up this idea. I was like, we're not a cannabis company. We're not a cannabis lab. We're a natural products lab. We can do environmental lab. We're an analytics company. We're a science company, and we currently specialize in cannabis. And I was trying to point out that this is important for several reasons. One, it gives you a perceptual shift to think about how you're operating. But also it does simple things like preserve your ability to have a bank account
And
or a
a credit card
website,
processor
like
and a
little
credit card.
right,
Yeah.
little things like this. And the president of the company stood up after me and basically washed away everything I had said by saying, well, some of us are not ashamed to be working with cannabis, and you shouldn't be either. And I'm like,
That's
oh
not what
man,
you were getting at
yeah,
entirely.
you completely missed my point. Yeah, it's like
Well, the other problem too was certain states at the beginning, you weren't allowed to test anything else.
yeah, yeah,
I
that's
know
true.
Michigan, funny, you weren't allowed to test anything but cannabis, which cuts, hamstrings you right off the
Hmm.
bat.
Yep.
Which, unless you had, so people would get around it by having speed.
Yeah, right. Yep,
They set up a sweet fee that they would get mail at for whatever. They split the, LLC, split the company kind of thing, and
yep,
it was a wholly owned subsidiary, blah blah. But it's everybody knows that when you like, if you're investing, you got a 401k or if you got a retirement, they always tell you make sure you diversify.
yeah, that's right.
Don't
Yeah,
put all your eggs in one basket.
yeah,
Well, why would you do that with company too, especially when you have the capability? I mean, if you got a bunch of trained chemists and you need SOPs. And the nice thing too about a lot of these agricultural testing things that are out there, the methods are already developed and validated. Everything's already been done for you. You just have to do a verification on site, get it added to your ISO accreditation scope. And half the time you don't even need that. You just have to have the validated accredited method depending on what it is
right.
you're doing. So like you don't even have to do development. You just buy a validated method, verify that it works on site, and you're good to go. I mean, it seems like a no-brainer, but at the same time, you run into people like your former boss,
Hmm.
shareholder. We're cannabis. We're special. You're not special. We are not a special snowflake. As they said in Fight Club, you are not a special
You're
snowflake.
right. Right. No, it's true. And it's something that it annoyed me that I was getting called out as if I was ashamed about cannabis because it's like that has nothing to do with this at all. My concern is long-term viability of the business.
And it is. It's a financial and fiscal responsibility to not just focus on cannabis because it is so volatile and the customers are so fickle if they ever even pay you that you can't.
Right. And it's like
I mean,
I want this team to like still have jobs in 3 years. It's
yeah.
like that's
And like you mentioned, like God, getting a bank account for a cannabis, even for I mean, I would argue up and down with people that we are just a lab, we're just testing, which also I was talking to a couple of lawyers right before everything folded with my own company, and they actually thought that they had an interesting legal argument that they were trying to see if we would pay them for it, but to use a us as a way to negate the entire cannabis as a controlled substance.
mm,
The theory was that because we were a hemp testing lab in a hemp only state
right.
and we are a laboratory
Hmm.
trying to grow hemp, but it was basically Schrodinger's hemp or Schrodinger's THC. It was we didn't know if that sample was illegal or not until we tested it, which then made us a felon or not.
Right. Are we criminals? Let's find out.
It's basically, and that was like you can't. It's unconstitutional. Like literally, with our justice system, it is unconstitutional to put somebody in that spot. That it is, they are,
Hmm.
they they may be unknowingly a felon based on it just being there, and they thought we were the perfect vehicle for that because we were a lab,
Hmm.
and well, of course, we didn't have the money to fund them to go and
Hmm.
take it on. Would have been nice, but
There's
I think it actually has pretty decent legs, but
Well,
it's going to cost a million.
there's a similar argument being built about around psilocybin testing right now. Because a lot of the labs doing psilocybin testing are in that exact situation. They're like, we don't know if these samples have psilocybin in them or not until
Mm-hmm.
we measure it, and then we see it's there, but then the sample's been destroyed at that point. So it's like
And
even
what
though we see it, are we like, what is our, legal status?
Well, and the fun part is in order to do that, you have to be DEA registered, DEA
Hmm.
approved. But the problem with acquiring DEA registration approval, one is that the
Uh-huh.
DEA will not register, not approve. If you test cannabis before applying, they will not. It is the
Yeah.
unwritten rule. They will send
They'll
you
drag it out
something.
forever.
Yep. It took me 2 years, and they never. But the other big problem is that once you are DEA registered, you are only allowed to accept product from another
Hmm.
DEA
That's
registered
right.
facility.
That's right. Yeah.
So you are automatically in violation of that DEA registration as soon as you accept your first sample.
Yep. Yep.
So,
So what do you do?
you're stuck in this weird catch 22 in it, and then you throw in the Schrodinger's THC, and it's like, ugh,
Yeah.
what do you do? There's got to be eventually there's got to be somebody at the federal level that steps in on this one, but that's a whole other ball of wax and takes. I think you could
Yeah.
fill probably 3 episodes.
I agree. Yeah. Oh no, this has been a great discussion. I know we've been going on for almost 2 hours now. But this has been really good. I mean, we've hit on a lot of kind of good areas in terms of just this whole puzzle around cannabis testing and the state of things. And I guess to kind of start to close out, what are some of your final thoughts on moving forward in terms of are there things that, sort of simple things you think both producers and labs could do to kind of improve the situation? Do you have any advice to regulators on things that they should be thinking about to improve the situation? And yeah, what's your best advice for moving forward?
Um, for labs, hire trained microbiologists.
Yeah, it's a good
That's the
start.
start. I mean, and actually find somebody that knows what they're talking about with microbiology. Chemists and biochemists pick up bad habits that do not translate to microbiology. Aseptic technique is absolutely huge. And I can't tell you how many times I've had to walk around with a ruler and slapping people's wrists with it whenever I would come into a place and try to train people on aseptic technique because they had so many bad habits I had to break.
And in case
Um,
anyone isn't following that from the lab stuff, the main thing is like chemists don't think about microbiology at all
yep,
because we don't like
solvents.
we can handle things out in the open, like do all sorts of things, and there's no consequence really, because we're dealing with chemicals. But when you're dealing with organisms and things that are alive, all these other things, you have to think on a totally different level on how you're
Like
handling the samples and what you're doing.
when I'm plating stuff, I even hold my breath. Like
Yeah,
I
yeah.
have the plate top on.
Mm-hmm.
Are you underneath the vent? It could be dropping contamination down on your plate. You know, I 70% IPA on your gloves in between touching damn near anything or wipe down before
Mm-hmm.
making sure your pipette tip box stays closed whenever and not putting your pipette in it and letting it sit there. Oh, that
Guilty.
oh. As somebody that used to have had a poor college lab professor that forced me to fill those tip boxes myself ourselves,
Uh-huh. Yep, yep, yep.
autoclave them. The amount of times that that has got knocked over and wasted hours of my life.
Mm-hmm.
Internal. Um, but for the labs, you need to look at your own facilities. Hire somebody that's appropriate for the position. I know it's hard. Microbiologists are a little odd, and this is as being one. We're a little odd. They're either the environmental guys or the clinical guys. I
Mm-hmm.
personally, this I would pick up. They know higher standards. It's just they're very, very. The clinical one side is usually very conservative, and it's going to be hard to get them in. But you got to
Yeah.
pay because you're competing with biotech and pharma for their pay for their spot.
Yeah.
So they're getting biotech and pharma salary. You need to make sure it's worth it to come over here. For growers, processors, producers, I would say when you're picking a lab, most of the time, I know it happens pretty much everywhere. Guy comes in, you want to tour the facility, you want to see the lab.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Look not just at the fancy equipment that they have floating around. Look at ask them where their microbiology section is.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Does it look clean? Does it look like they actually spray it down and sanitize it whenever they're doing stuff? Does it, you know, even better if there's somebody sitting there and prepping something while you're walking through, are they actually using are they being methodical? Are they in a dry box, which is basically just a plexiglass box, but it,
Mm-hmm.
it contains, it keeps the airflow from cross contamination for PCRs? Do they have a biosafety cabinet, which is a big metal hood that costs about $20,000, but they sit at for the culture?
Yep.
Um, if you ask them about culturing, do they know what the hell they're talking about?
That's one of the big ones. Just start to ask them what they're doing and see how they talk about it.
Ask them to describe culturing or PCR. Do they sound like they know what they're talking about? Again, PCR, it's simple. It's a DNA photocopier.
Yep.
There's nothing fancy. Glorified, and even the thermocycler is a fancy heating block. It's
Right.
just a very, very tightly controlled heating. Terry Mullins was the guy who invented this process, and he originally did it in water baths, and he would
Yeah.
just take them
Manually. Yeah.
yeah, and he invented the process so he could then go off and spend his days surfing because it was taking too long. He's my hero.
Yeah, that's awesome. Yeah.
He just died a couple of years ago. But and also too, because we've started doing a lot of environmental testing as a kind of a add-on service, just that expanding the services.
Mhm.
When they actually come out and look at it, ask them, what are they doing? Why are they doing it? I'm sorry, and ATP sticks are not sufficient for environmental swabbing,
Mm.
which is what a lot of labs will do. Yes, it's good as a tool and as a
Mhm.
piece of your process, but it is
Right.
not your end all be all because ATP only registers metabolically active cultures.
Mhm.
I had a situation just a couple weeks ago where somebody is flash freezing and lyophilizing or freeze drying their
Mhm.
product, bubble hash. Well, when you freeze dry something, it is no longer metabolically active. So you can ATP swab that piece of equipment as much as you want. It will always come back negative until you resuspend it in water and then it is all of a sudden covered in mold.
Yeah, I've witnessed that personally. Yep.
So do
That's
they know how
gross.
to culture? Do they know
Yeah.
if you ask them, any microbiology person is going to be able to tell you different culture media, or at least to discuss them.
Right.
Why have they chosen this? Do they know why this is being selected? So especially with environmental monitoring, you're setting it up, you're giving your facility your baseline, you're basing your accreditation and your facility on this information. Make sure they're doing more than the bare minimum. And to be honest, it's worth the money. It
Yeah.
absolutely is worth the money. And I tell people, especially with like GMP, even if you're not getting the accreditation, set yourself up and get the SOPs. Do
Mhm.
everything but pay
Yeah.
because
Yeah. Exactly.
it will make your product more consistent, training easier, and it will make you easily able to figure out or more easily able to figure out what the problems are. And it's just also things like batch and lot number tracking. The
Yeah.
reason why you want to track those, and from a realistic standpoint or from an actual everyday application standpoint, is if you track the lot numbers of your products and anything that comes in that door, whether it be cleaning, whether it be grow media, whether it be whatever, if you track those lot numbers and you can trace a problem back to that lot
Mhm.
specifically, then it is that supplier's responsibility
That's
and
right.
liability. You can go after them for wages or lost, whatever
Right.
you spent and damage for fucking up the process. Sorry.
No, you're good.
So, I swear like a sailor sometimes, a drunken sailor sometimes. So
But
I mean,
it's true. It's like if you don't have proper monitoring and tracking and all of these things, you have no way to move responsibility away from yourself. And rightfully so, because you're not being
it's a
responsible at that
liability thing.
point.
Yeah,
Yeah, no, it
you're not
is.
responsible. It's them.
Hmm.
It's kind of one of those. What do they say with your budget? If you're not tracking where your dollars go,
Hmm.
your budget tracks or it does it. I forget the saying, but it's the same
Right.
thing as with your budget. You want to know where your money's going. You want to assign it, so at least it's a lot easier to understand what your habits are and what the problems
Hmm.
are if you're tracking it. And you don't. It doesn't have to be as astronomically detailed. It can
No,
just be a simple spreadsheet. Okay, received on this date, lot number this, received
that's
by
right.
X.
That's super simple. And a lot of the quality systems I've helped really small companies set up, that's usually what it is. It's like just a series of relatively
Mhm.
simple spreadsheets capturing the core information
Yep.
that you're going to need to, make decisions and things. And then you can always make it more detailed, more complicated as you grow and as you have resources.
Or as you
But
find things that you need, and
exactly, yeah,
like
yeah.
for regulators, please, 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 when you're writing rules and legislation, talk to an actual microbiologist. Talk to an please. I understand when things need to be get done, and I was a lobbyist for a little while, well, for my company. I understand the process. I understand how this stuff goes. I mean, I get it. At the same time, you're making regulations that are binding people
Hmm.
like to the process. And if the process is this catch-22 that you put us in, it makes it very difficult to do anything, and incentivizes things like the black market, incentivizes things like lab shopping because of the way these policies are set up.
Yeah.
Like, like I know coliform picked just from the water testing. I mean
Hmm.
that's where they pulled it from. Total yeast and mold, I'm not really sure where they pulled that regulation from, but it's fine. I get it. No, I'm not saying don't do it, but like just
I feel like the
be
yeast and mold
conscious and
most.
ask a couple of experts first.
Right. And a lot of times these subcommittees and things that get formed, there's always politics behind how these committees come together and who's at the table and everything. But it seems rare that they bring in people with experience beyond the cannabis industry, like
Yes.
beyond, you know what I mean? Like people that can bring a perspective of, let's say, natural products testing, agricultural testing, that sort of thing. Like how would someone with that background view these problems versus someone who's coming from the ground up,
So
within the
actually,
industry.
along that line, I people from the pharmaceutical industry as much as
Mhm.
I they're getting better, but some of the initial cannabis science programs were not sufficient. I had to retrain for too much. Like I said, they've gotten a lot better,
Mhm.
but even my suppliers, I don't talk to anything that's even for grows and processing facilities. I usually tell them if it is specifically marketed for the cannabis industry, you're overpaying and it's not working as well as it needs to. Just
Yeah. Yeah.
ignore them. If you're any kind of facility, treat it like a restaurant kitchen.
Mhm.
Treat it like a food service kitchen. Stainless steel everything, and it's kind of a good guideline. The other one is if you're looking for decontamination things, look at places that decontaminate hospitals. Look at places that
Mhm.
do clean rooms. They know how to do this. They're gonna sound more expensive, but in reality, they're probably cheaper, and they get it done right the first time rather than having to have somebody come in 6 times and overcharge you every single time because they don't know what the hell they're doing.
And the support's almost always better too. Yeah.
Absolutely. And a lot of them, this is a side business for cannabis is a side industry for them, so they don't even like it's
Hmm.
okay, but they're gonna want payment up front, but at the same time, it gets done right. It's done.
Yep. Yep.
It's not, Joe Schmo that decided to start this decontamination business that has no experience doing anything and is now selling you something that won't even doesn't even have the right dwell time to sit on surfaces.
Well, yeah, and now we've also got this movement too towards, because of the controversies around yeast and mold testing and aspergillus, we now have this push towards the X-ray decontamination systems and
Gamma
that sort of
radiating
thing.
everything in the
Hmm.
bags, just like supplies. Yeah.
Yeah, and so it's interesting how these issues trickle out and lead to these decisions, which, like I said early on, my experience in Oregon, I've seen that it is possible
Mhm.
to do things in a way where you're going to pass these tests, even if the tests are ridiculous and too sensitive and all these things, you can still pass.
Mhm.
And so seeing the fear that has come about around all these topics that's now pushing people to invest in equipment that they probably don't need and that consumers are going to kind of like turn a side eye to.
Mhm.
And a lot of these producers don't want to publicly acknowledge that they're irradiating their stuff,
Uh-huh.
which creates, other issues there.
Or
It's
dipping it in hydrogen peroxide before it's sent off
right.
to
Ah,
lab, or
yes. Oh my
all the
gosh.
sterotol getting spraying it on before it gets
Yeah.
sampled. Oh God.
Yeah. So, I hope that from this conversation, people realize some of the complexities and nuances around how these quality requirements affect things and the testing rules and everything, and these sort of unintended consequences of tackling problems without good monitoring or data. And it highlights the need too for I think one problem that we have with the education bit in terms of a lot of labs utilizing people who are not getting well trained and things is partially because they feel like they don't have the money to hire people to pay someone what they're really, what they really should get paid. So then they pull people straight out of undergrad or graduate school, and pay them like a very low entry rate thing, and then expect them to learn it all and figure it out. And
Oh
so
yeah. Or
figuring
they
out that.
hire a lab director with CSO job, or you know,
Mhm.
that's the big one I see. We'll hire somebody that I knew a guy that he wanted to hire somebody to run two sites. One of them still hadn't been accredited, so it was to finalize the ISO
Mhm.
17025 accreditation on the second site, but oversee the two sites and basically do a CSO job for 65 to $90,000 a year.
Yeah, yep, that
That's
sounds
a
about
hundred
right.
30 to $150,000 a year job. Just
Yeah.
so if anybody's actually won that
Yeah.
price tag for a person that is actually qualified for those jobs and oversee two facilities, that is absolutely
Yeah.
that's $150,000 a year job.
Yeah, absolutely. It's yeah, it's a
Sorry.
series, no, you're fine. It's an onion of problems in terms of the layers and how they're connected. The labs need greater margins so that they can rationalize paying people better, get better talent, and all of these things. You have all these pressures kind of crushing any window of resources to, begin to do that. And I think coming back around, the practical solution: stop putting all your eggs in the cannabis basket, because that will widen your margins and that will give you those abilities and attract people that maybe are a little skeptical of just getting into cannabis, but would be more interested in doing broader scientific work with cannabis.
And I'd like to put for the labs out there, I understand the need and the want to bring in business. I really,
Right.
I've been doing this for 6 years. I get it. At the same time, when you decide to go to the price wars, and I've had this happen before where even if it's a short-term run, they'll put out $200
Mm-hmm.
a full panel testing. That is so far below. I know why they're doing it. They're using it to drive out the people that can't afford to,
Right.
even if it's just for a couple of months, they're using it to drive people out and all that. By you tanking that price, you're tanking the industry. You're
Yeah.
tanking everything around you. And I get it, you're trying to corner the market. At the same time, is it worth it to destroy the industry around you?
Yep.
I mean, some people are going to say yes and just do it. That's them. I think the long-term damage that things like that does, I think it far outweighs the short-term version of, okay, I'm gonna knock a few people of my competitors out and try to corner the market. So it's a strategy thing, I get it, but
It's not
it makes
indicative.
it tough. It
It's
makes it
not
so tough.
it's not indicative of a wise long-term strategy overall, because like you said, it ultimately incentivizes producers to start to expect radically unrealistic turnaround times, radically unrealistic costs that they then carry over when that run is done. They still expect that.
Or they
And
leave,
or
or
they
they just
leave.
leave.
Exactly. And they
I
look for
mean,
someone else who will deliver it. And it's a vicious cycle that just pushes things further and further. And there's nothing that ensures that lab that initially started that price collapse will still be around the next year as the cycles continue.
and I
Uh,
and I mean, yeah, as things progress and technology, things get cheaper. Yeah, I get it. But when you're $50 to $100 under cost
yeah.
for a lab, I mean
What
that.
business does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
yeah, it's a loss leader. I get it, but but that's your product. That is your only product, and the people that are chasing those dollars are going to leave as soon as that deal's up. I mean,
Yep.
that's the way this industry works. And really that's the way
Yeah,
a lot of industries works, is you get the people that are only there for the discounts and the coupons do not
there's no
stick
loyalty.
around.
Yeah.
And in my experience, they tend to be the biggest pain in the ass too.
Oh yeah. No, they usually eat
complain
up the
about everything.
most of your time. Yeah. No, absolutely.
20% of your customers are 80% of your problems.
That's right. That's right. That's right.
So,
Well, yeah, this
but yeah, those would be my big suggestions from regulators. Just ask, just ask.
yeah.
We'll tell you. You don't have to do it, but at least then we feel like we're part of the process, and we can
Yeah,
then
it'd
at
be
least we can
nice.
just complain that you didn't listen to us. But I mean, at least you asked us.
Right.
From anybody but the labs in the industry, the labs, we're your partners. I mean, a good
Mhm.
lab will be a partner. They will help you out. They will
Yeah.
try to explain things to you. They will not, they won't treat you like an idiot.
Yeah.
So just ask them. And most of us we're here because we want to help you.
Yeah.
We're part of this industry too. We're all in this together. We want things to go off well. We just want people. I originally, the tagline for my first company was medical grade cannabis deserves medical grade testing.
Yeah.
And my problem comes when people, we try to say this is medicine. We say this is a thing, and people are using this as medicine. When you say this is medicine, that has a very specific connotation. That has a
Right.
very specific thing that comes with it. And it means that what you say, what is on that label is in it and nothing else.
Yeah.
And it is
Right.
exactly what they're getting. And if you want to play the medical game and you want to play in those alleys, people expect certain things. And to be honest, if you piss around in that long
Mhm.
enough, the FDA is going to force you to play in that game, and you
Yep.
cannot afford to play around with the pharma boys.
That's right.
You can't. You won't. Yeah, it's just a
Mhm.
thing. They have multi-billion-dollar budgets, and also, guys, stability testing is $10,000 to $15,000 a SKU. So start preparing.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. I
mean,
mean, it's yes. Yep. And I'll point out too that there are big companies that are still sitting on the sidelines waiting for things to become favorable for them to step into lab testing as well. So the
Quest Diagnostics is waiting. Oh, they are just sitting there waiting. Smithers has already started to come in. They've already started adding their division, but yeah, Quest and LabCorp are just waiting.
yeah,
It's gonna be a nightmare.
it's going to change this whole realm of cannabis testing. It's still due for a lot of changes, and some very substantial changes. And if we do see descheduling happen in the next few years or whatever, rescheduling, either one, particularly rescheduling, that will start to be when those companies will start to, take things more seriously in terms of expanding out and
The
getting
tobacco
into this
guys are
market.
already starting to get in. I think it was a year ago, there was that big to-do
Mhm.
about the board of advisors for Raw was bought
Yeah.
out. And there was a quiet not acquisition by their board getting replaced by Winston-Salem or something like that.
Oh,
I mean,
wow. Yeah.
I don't know but Raw got a huge amount of money just basically as a placeholder so that, so
When
they're
things,
dipping their toes in. I mean, hell, I think it's Marlboro that's had the patent on a joint held since like the 70s. That's why everything's
right.
code. You can't call it a joint because that's covered already. Somebody's
Yeah.
got, so, but
Yeah.
yeah, there's, even on our side, once federalization comes in, there's gonna be a big shakeup and it's gonna be turbulent and
Yep.
no one knows exactly how it's gonna go. But all I can say is that whatever you are putting into your R&D budget and your testing budget now, as you project things out, start budgeting for increasing it.
Yeah.
Just
Yeah.
not saying you got to go crazy, but eventually it's going to go up. When the FDA steps in, they're going to
Yep.
require beginning, middle, and end of lot batch testing. That's 3 from each position in your batch.
Yep.
They're all going to have to be tested.
Not to
That's
mention
gonna
the
increase the cost.
ingredient verification. That's
Ingredient verifications, yeah,
that can
sodium,
cost
cholesterol.
in case
Yep,
anyone's
all of
wondering,
that's
because I've done the budgets for this. If you start getting into real GMP compliance, like dietary supplement or higher level compliance, you're going to need to add usually between 30 and 50 grand to your testing budget just for ingredient checking, just for ingredient verification, COA verification.
I would start building your budget out by about 10 to 15% per year just to give yourself the room and keep it keep it aside.
Yeah.
Unless you absolutely need it, put that aside because it's going to get there. There might be ways you can get around stability testing for smaller people. They might have grandfather clauses
Right.
in there. They might have small business clauses in
Right.
there. It might be like the grocery stores with bread where they just say it's a blanket 6 days.
Right.
And so you don't have to do that, but you're still going to have to do the verification lot testing. And if it's a consumer packaged good, they are going to require you to do more in-depth microbial panel that will involve things
Yep.
like listeria. They will involve things like campylobacter. There will be other stuff in there that, to be honest, none of the labs in cannabis, not even
Right.
mine, are equipped for that, because if you don't have to spend the money on it, we all know you're not going to spend no money on it.
Right. If it's not going to
It's
give
not
an immediate
required.
return, yeah, what's the point?
And if we test something and it hits positive, we have to report it, even if it's not a required testing. So like, you absolutely do not test more than you have to, which is,
That's another part of that nuance of the incentive structures and how they're set up. Yep.
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 So, but prepare, set your stuff up for the labs, just spend the money. I get it. It's tough, but
You're going to spend the money one way or another and costs. I mean,
and anybody, and in the words, or another, I talked to Analytical Cannabis about setting up a cannabis lab, and the very first thing I told them right then was don't.
yeah, I mean, honestly, that's my general. I've had quite a few people come to me asking me about investing or starting businesses, and inevitably they get interested in cannabis testing labs because it's like that side business that's like, well, they're not really a cannabis business and they're not really
they think they can dabble, but
exactly, yeah. And it's like,
no.
nah, and my general recommendation is just
Don't.
don't.
If
Unless
you do, you're not in it for the money, and don't expect the money. Anybody that's investing, this is not a tech stock. It will not be a tech stock. You are lucky if you're break even at 3 years.
That's right. That's exactly right. Yep. And so it's just be realistic, be practical about your approach. And like we said, think creatively on how to operate your lab so that you're not just creating immense overhead and driving yourself into a deeper hole that builds all of that pressure. The deeper you get, the more pressure above you. So like, let's just not dig so deep. And their strategies. And if you need to learn more about that, Josh and I are great people to call up and ask these questions too, because we care a lot about trying to see labs do well and to see the industry do well and to see transparency and to see trust. I mean, really, I think that's one thing that you and I kind of like really bonded over was we both want to see the trust come back to all of this. We want customers to be able to trust the labels they're reading and the data and to be able to make informed decisions. Because right now they're not really making informed decisions. They're making decisions based on illusions. And we want to see that come into the light and improve and be what we know it can be.
And trust is everything in this industry. It really is.
And it is a much smaller industry than people give it credit for. And when things do go awry and people are doing screwy things, we learn about it. We all talk, we all know. And so it's a matter of time before those things shake out.
It's one of those, there's a lot of very not well hidden secrets of who's doing what. Everybody knows.
Yep, that's right. Yep. So this has been a very spicy episode. I hope that you've all enjoyed it, especially those of you that have listened all the way through. This is going to be one of my good. I like it whenever I come around and do these like 2 hour plus episodes, because that's really where things get exciting. I like the long form. So thank you so much if you've listened to the whole thing. Really, really appreciate it. I hope you've gotten something out of it, learned some things, and maybe thought of some new questions to ask or new conversations to start to have with those around you in the industry or with testing labs or regulators or anything else like that. It's clear that there are a lot of problems that we have to address, and some of them are not really big problems. It's just practical solutions that need to be applied that we already have examples for in adjacent industries, and we just have to, like you said, we've got to really resist this urge to think of cannabis as something special and recognize that it is a piece of something that fits into a lot of systems we already have. And we can start to deal with a lot of this insanity just in that way. So Josh, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. Great to be able to sit down with you again and talk, and we'll definitely have to stay in touch. It's always good getting to chat about all of these issues that we bang our heads against the wall every day about.
Absolutely. I mean, we could have made this a lot spicier too. This was
yeah. I mean, we didn't even
really spicy. This was
yeah.
This was more mild. This is
this is the mild spice.
Medium.
Yeah, might have to have an OnlyFans or something for the spicy bits.
Yeah, or put the warning on it for libel.
Right, exactly. Please don't.
These are changed. The names have been changed to protect.
Yeah.
Oh God.
And I wanted to make sure I didn't miss for those that want to learn more about you and your lab and all that sort of stuff. In the last second we have here, let people know how to connect with you, how to learn anything about what you have going on, or anything else that you want to share. Feel free to take the floor.
I mean, so Therapeutic Health Choice, we do testing for the entire cannabis industry. We're doing environmental sampling, any number of things out of Bay City, Michigan. I also do consulting on the side. So, but regardless, if you are in the area and you're looking for testing, give us a call. It's 989-459-2000. My email is jsmith@thchoice.com. And we'll be happy to work something out with you and figure something out. And to be honest, even if you have questions on a lab or a COA or anything like that doesn't make sense or doesn't look right to you, reach out. I'm always willing to help people out in the industry and take a look at things, because there are a lot of screwy stuff, especially in the side of things. I will say, check your expiration dates on any COA you get, especially in the Hemp side. So, but thanks, Jason, for having me. I had a great time.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, very, very good. I appreciate it. And yeah, everyone, thank you so much for tuning in. Stay curious and take it easy, everybody.